They say the camera adds 10 pounds, but on Mayor Thompson, it mostly just added layers of insincerity. I sat in the high-backed leather chair of the town hall's makeshift broadcast studio, the red light of camera 2 blinking like a taunting eye. To my left, Thompson was adjusting his tie for the 4th time, his face slick with the kind of sweat that comes from knowing you're about to do something cowardly while pretending it's courageous. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I've spent 32 years as the chief engineer of this town. I know where every pipe is buried, every structural flaw in the bridge on 4th Street, and exactly how many pounds of pressure the local dam can take before the concrete starts to groan. But apparently, all that knowledge was less valuable than the fact that the mayor's nephew, Kyle, had just finished a 6-month online course in urban development and needed a prestigious seat to park his ego. "Forest," Thompson said, his voice dropping into that rehearsed, gravelly tone he used for funerals and ribbon cuttings. "The council has reviewed the budget. With the new modernization initiative, we feel the department needs a fresh perspective. Someone with an eye on the future." I leaned back, crossing my legs and offering a thin, sharp smile. I knew the feed was live. I knew half the town was watching over their morning coffee. "A fresh perspective," I repeated, letting the sarcasm hang in the air like a heavy fog. "Is that what we're calling nepotism these days? It's a bit wordy, Arthur. You should stick to the classics." Thompson's eye twitched. Behind him, standing in the shadows of the studio wing, was Kyle. He was 28, wearing a suit that cost more than my first truck and a smirk that suggested he'd already picked out the new furniture for my office. He looked like he'd never seen a wrench in his life, let alone used one to fix a main break at 3 a.m. "We're moving in a different direction," Thompson continued, ignoring my jab. He turned to face the camera, his expression transforming into one of feigned regret. "Forest Calder has served this community for decades, but as of this moment, he is relieved of his duties. Kyle Vance will be stepping in as the interim director of engineering, effective immediately." The silence that followed was intended to be somber. I made sure it was uncomfortable instead. I didn't stand up. I didn't storm out. I just sat there, looking directly into the lens of the camera, my expression one of calm, detached amusement. "Good luck with the 7th Avenue drainage project, Kyle," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the lapel mic. "The blueprints are in the 3rd cabinet, or at least the blueprints your uncle thinks are the right ones. You might find the reality of the subterranean bedrock a bit more stubborn than your textbooks suggested." I stood up slowly, the joints in my knees giving a satisfying pop. I walked off the set without waiting for a handshake, feeling the heat of the studio lights fade as I stepped into the hallway. My daughter, Clara, was waiting near the exit. Her face was a mask of concern, her hands clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "Dad, I can't believe he did it on air," she whispered, falling into step beside me as we exited the building into the crisp morning air. "It's humiliating. Are you okay? You seem oddly fine." "I'm better than fine, Clara," I said, pulling my sunglasses from my pocket. "I'm liberated. For 30 years I've been the one holding the umbrella over this town. Now I'm just going to stand back and watch the rain." "But what about your pension? Your reputation?" She sounded frantic, the way people do when they think the world is ending because a paycheck stopped. "My reputation is built on concrete and steel, not a vote from a man who can't spell infrastructure without a spell checker," I replied. I stopped at my truck, a battered but reliable piece of machinery that had seen more honest work than the entire town council combined. "Go home, Clara. Don't worry about me. Worry about the mayor. He just handed a Ferrari to a toddler who doesn't know which pedal is the brake." As I drove away, my phone began to vibrate in the center console. I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly who it was. It was Miller, the head of the regional construction firm currently under contract for the new downtown plaza. Miller was a hard man who hated delays and hated incompetence even more. He knew Kyle couldn't manage a Lego set, let alone a multi-million-dollar public works project. I took the long way home, passing the various sites that bore my signature, the retaining walls, the sewage treatment plant, the neatly paved cul-de-sacs. I had spent my life making this town functional. People took it for granted. They turned on the tap and expected water. They drove over a bridge and expected it to hold. They had no idea how much of that stability relied on the meticulous notes I kept in my private journals, notes that were currently sitting in a locked safe at my house, not in the filing cabinets at Town Hall. When I arrived home, I went straight to my office. It was a room filled with the scent of old paper and cedar. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, watching the local news feed. The public firing was already trending on the town's social media page. The comments were a chaotic mix of outrage and confusion. I saw a video clip of the mayor's office taken just 10 minutes after I left. The hallway was a hive of activity. Kyle was standing in the center of a group of contractors, looking pale. He was holding a phone to his ear, gesturing wildly with his free hand. One of the contractors, a man named Rick, who I'd worked with for 15 years, was shouting. Rick was an opportunist. He'd been one of the first to jump ship when he heard Thompson was looking to replace me, hoping to secure easier contracts under a less observant director. "I don't care what the computer says." Rick's voice was audible even through the grainy cell phone footage someone had uploaded. "The pressure readings are spiking, and if we don't bypass the secondary valve, the whole site is going to be underwater by noon." Kyle looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole. He was flipping through a manual, his fingers trembling. "The manual says the secondary valve is automated," he yelled back. I chuckled to myself, leaning back in my chair. The secondary valve hadn't been automated since the winter of '98 when the sensors froze and nearly flooded the basement of the library. I'd bypassed the automation manually every season since. It was a quirk of the system, one of 1,000 little secrets that weren't in any manual. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Rick. "Forest. I know we had our differences about the new contract, but I need the override code for the 7th Avenue station. The kid doesn't know what he's doing. Help me out here." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glass. I thought about the way Rick had smirked at me during the last council meeting when I was questioned about my outdated methods. I thought about how he'd already started billing the town for materials he hadn't bought, assuming I wouldn't be around to audit the invoices. I typed back a simple response. "I'm retired, Rick. I hear the new director has a fresh perspective. Maybe he can find the code in his textbook." I put the phone down and walked to the window. My house sat on a hill overlooking the valley. In the distance, I could see the shimmering grid of the town. It looked peaceful, but I knew the truth. I had built a complex machine, and the people in charge had just fired the only mechanic who knew how to keep it from shaking itself apart. A few minutes later, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. It was Clara again, but this time she wasn't alone. Lila, my niece, was with her. Lila was younger, sharper, and worked as a junior clerk in the mayor's office. She had a look on her face that was a mix of terror and excitement. They burst into the office without knocking. "Dad, you have to see this," Clara said, holding up her tablet. "The mayor is losing his mind," Lila added, her voice high-pitched with adrenaline. "The contractors are threatening to walk off the job. Rick is telling everyone that you sabotaged the files before you left. He's telling the media that you deleted the override codes." I didn't blink. "I didn't delete anything, Lila. I just didn't write them down in the public ledger. There's a difference between sabotage and proprietary knowledge. If they want my brain, they have to pay for the whole package. They can't just fire the man and keep the thoughts." "They're talking about legal action," Clara warned, her eyes wide. "Thompson is telling the press that you're endangering the town's safety." I stood up and walked over to my bookshelf, pulling out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. I slapped it down on the desk with a heavy thud. "Let them talk. I have every inspection report, every private memo, and every recorded conversation with the mayor from the last 5 years. If they want to play the safety card, I'll show the world how many times Thompson asked me to ignore safety violations to save money on his re-election projects." Lila leaned in, her eyes gleaming. "You have all that? On record?" "I'm an engineer, Lila," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I don't guess. I document. This isn't about a job anymore. This is about showing them exactly what happens when you try to replace a foundation with a coat of paint." Outside, the first siren of the day began to wail in the distance. It was the high-pitched alert from the 7th Avenue station. The pressure had clearly reached the limit. I looked at the clock. It had been exactly 2 hours since I was fired. The chaos was ahead of schedule. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, but a profound sense of clarity. They thought they could humiliate me and move on. They thought I was a relic of the past, a grumpy old man who could be tossed aside. They were about to learn that a relic is often the only thing holding the whole structure up. "What are you going to do?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. I picked up my coffee mug, which was still warm. I took a slow, methodical sip and looked out at the town. "I'm going to do exactly what they told me to do," I said. "I'm going to sit here and enjoy my retirement, and I'm going to watch the fresh perspective of the new administration unfold." As the sirens grew louder, I noticed a second car pulling into my driveway. It was a news van from the local station. They wanted a statement, they wanted drama, they wanted to see the fallen man in his moment of defeat. I straightened my shirt and checked my reflection in the window. I looked calm. I looked capable. I looked like a man who knew exactly where the cracks were forming, and exactly how long it would take for the whole thing to crumble. I turned to Lila. Go back to the office. Keep your ears open. If Thompson mentions my name, I want to know the exact context. And Clara, stay here. You might want to see how this next part goes." I walked toward the front door, the sarcastic internal monologue that had sustained me for decades. Now a loud, rhythmic pulse in my head. They wanted a show. I was going to give them a masterpiece. I opened the door to a flurry of camera flashes and shouting reporters. In the background, the smoke from a small electrical fire at the pumping station was just beginning to smudge the blue horizon. "Mr. Calder," a reporter yelled, shoving a microphone toward my face, "do you have any comment on the emergency at 7th Avenue? I smiled. It was a predatory, knowing smile that I knew would look terrifying on the evening news. "I'm sure Director Vance has everything under control," I said smoothly. "He's the man with the eye on the future, after all. I'm just a man with a past." I stepped back and closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like the first movement of a very long, very planned symphony. The first betrayal had been public. The revenge, however, would be personal. The morning after the televised spectacle was surprisingly quiet. My kitchen was bathed in a soft amber glow as the sun rose over the valley, casting long shadows across the architectural diagrams spread over my breakfast table. I sat there with a lukewarm cup of black coffee, watching the digital feed on my tablet. The local news was already looping footage of the 7th Avenue incident, as they were calling it. They showed Kyle standing knee-deep in a muddy trench, his expensive suit trousers ruined, looking at a burst pipe with the bewildered expression of a man trying to solve a Rubik's Cube in the dark. I felt a twinge of satisfaction, but I didn't let it settle. Satisfaction is a stagnant emotion. I preferred the momentum of preparation. I had spent decades learning that a building doesn't fall because of one big hit. It fails because of 1,000 microscopic stresses that eventually find a common rhythm. My goal wasn't to destroy the town, I loved this place too much for that, but to demonstrate the absolute necessity of the man they had discarded. I spent the next few hours in my home office, a room Thompson had once called the Museum of the Obsolete. It was filled with physical files, handwritten surveys, and geological maps that predated the city's digital database. The digital database was a sleek, user-friendly interface that Kyle likely thought was the ultimate authority. What he didn't know was that the digital records were based on a survey conducted in 2012 that had missed a 3-degree shift in the water table. I hadn't updated the digital file because the city council had refused to fund the necessary stabilization project 5 years ago. I had simply managed the shift manually, adjusting the pressure valves on the south side every Tuesday morning at 4 a.m. Today was Tuesday, and I was sitting in my kitchen. By 10 a.m., my phone was a constant source of vibration. Most of the calls were from contractors, but one name kept popping up, Mr. Rick. Rick was a man who viewed loyalty as a commodity to be traded for a higher profit margin. He had been my lead foreman for a decade, yet he'd spent the last 6 months whispering in the mayor's ear about how my methodical nature was actually obstructive bureaucracy. I finally answered on the 10th ring. "Forest, thank heavens." Rick's voice was strained, the sound of heavy machinery echoing in the background. "Listen, we're at the North End site. The soil density isn't matching the digital specs Kyle gave us. If we pour the foundation now, the whole thing will shift by autumn. The kid is telling us to proceed because the schedule is tight, but I'm looking at this silt and it's too loose." I leaned back in my chair, staring at a framed photograph of the bridge I'd built in '94. "That sounds like a professional challenge, Rick, and since I'm no longer the director of engineering, I believe that falls under Kyle's jurisdiction. Or perhaps you should consult the mayor. He's very fond of fresh perspectives." "Forrest, don't be like that," Rick pleaded, though the arrogance still simmered beneath his tone. "I've got 50 men on the clock and 6 cement mixers idling. If we don't pour, I lose $30,000 today. Just tell me which stabilizer we used on the Smith Street project. I know you kept a private log." "I did," I said, "and it's a very thorough log. It's also my personal property, purchased with my own funds and written on my own time. If Kyle wants to see it, he's welcome to make an appointment. My consultation fee is quite steep these days." I hung up before he could respond. It wasn't about the money. It was about the realization that his betrayal had a price tag he couldn't afford. I decided to take a walk. I needed to see the chaos for myself, not through a screen. I put on a casual jacket and a baseball cap, hoping to blend in. I drove downtown and parked 3 blocks away from the town square, where a major renovation was underway. This was Thompson's legacy project, a sprawling plaza that was supposed to be the centerpiece of his next campaign. As I walked toward the site, I saw the cracks in the facade. Not literally, not yet, but in the way the crew was moving. They were disorganized. 3 men were standing around a surveyor's level, arguing. Kyle was there too, looking frantic as he shouted into a radio. He looked smaller than he had on TV. Without the mahogany desk and the backing of his uncle, he was just a confused young man in a hard hat that sat slightly crooked on his head. I sat on a park bench across the street, opening a newspaper to shield my face. From my vantage point, I could see Rick's truck pull up. He hopped out and immediately began a heated discussion with Kyle. Rick gestured toward the excavation pit, then toward his watch. He was clearly demanding a decision. Kyle pointed to a tablet, likely showing him the very digital blueprints I knew were flawed. A local news crew arrived shortly after. They were looking for a follow-up to the morning's disaster. The reporter, a sharp woman named Sarah who had interviewed me a dozen times, spotted Kyle and moved in like a hawk. I watched as Kyle tried to maintain his composure. He smiled for the camera, the same practiced, empty smile his uncle used. I could see the sweat on his brow from 50 yards away. "Everything is moving according to plan," I heard him say as the wind carried his voice toward me. "We've encountered some minor geological inconsistencies, but nothing our modern software can't handle. We're actually ahead of schedule." Rick looked like he wanted to scream. He knew the software was only as good as the data, and the data was wrong. He looked over toward the park, his eyes scanning the benches. For a second, I thought he spotted me, but he looked away, his jaw clenched in frustration. I turned the page of my newspaper. I felt a strange sense of calm. This was the psychological weight of incompetence. It starts as a small worry in the back of the mind, a nagging feeling that something is wrong, and it grows until it consumes every waking moment. Kyle was currently experiencing the first stage. Rick was already at the second. By the afternoon, I moved to a local cafe that was a popular hangout for city employees. I sat in a corner booth, sipping tea and listening. In a small town, gossip is more reliable than the evening news. "Did you hear about the North End?" One woman, a secretary from the water department, whispered to her friend. "The pumps are cycling every 10 minutes. Kyle told the maintenance crew it was just a calibration issue, but they say the vibrations are rattling the windows in the foreman's shack." "And Thompson is furious," her friend replied. "He's got a ribbon cutting for the plaza next month, and the concrete won't set because of the moisture. He's blaming the suppliers, but everyone knows it's the site prep." The narrative was shifting. The fresh perspective was being revealed as a lack of foresight. As I left the cafe, I ran into Clara. She was coming out of a boutique, her face tight with stress. When she saw me, she pulled me aside into an alleyway. "Dad, what are you doing?" she hissed. "I've seen your truck parked all over town. People are starting to notice you watching." "I'm an engineer, Clara," I said. "Observing is part of the job description. I'm just conducting a post-employment audit." "Rick called me," she said, her voice dropping. "He said you're withholding information that could help the town. He said you're being spiteful." Spite is a very messy emotion, Clara. I'm being precise. If I give them the answers now, they'll never learn the value of the questions. And more importantly, they'll never admit they were wrong to fire me. "But the town is suffering," she argued. "There are water pressure issues on the west side, and the plaza project is a mess." "The town is experiencing the consequences of its leadership," I corrected her. "If a man chooses to fire his navigator while sailing through a storm, he doesn't get to blame the navigator when the ship hits the rocks." She sighed, shaking her head. "You're different, Dad. There's something cold about you lately." "Not cold," I said, patting her hand. "Just structural. I'm letting the weight distribute where it belongs." I left her there and headed back to my truck. As I drove, I passed the mayor's house. It was a grand, Victorian-style home with a perfectly manicured lawn. Thompson was standing in his driveway, talking to a man I recognized as a local council member. They both looked agitated. I slowed down just enough for Thompson to see me. I didn't wave, I didn't sneer. I simply looked at him, my expression neutral, and then accelerated away. I wanted him to know I was there. I wanted him to know that while he was drowning in the details of his own making, I was perfectly at peace. That evening, the first real blow to their confidence landed. I had sent an anonymous tip to the local environmental agency about the North End site. It wasn't a lie. The site actually was violating a minor runoff regulation that I had been managing through a series of temporary silt fences that needed daily maintenance. Since I had been fired, the fences hadn't been touched. I watched the 6 RPM news. The headline wasn't about the legacy project anymore. It was about an emergency stop work order issued for the North End. The environmental inspector was on screen, pointing to a stream of murky water flowing into the local creek. "The site is improperly managed," the inspector said. "Until the drainage is brought up to code, all construction must cease. This could delay the project by months." The camera cut to the mayor. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. He was trying to blame a clerical error in the engineering department. Then the camera panned to Kyle, who was standing behind him, looking absolutely shattered. But the real victory was Rick. He was shown in the background, throwing his hard hat onto the ground in a fit of rage. He knew that every day the site was closed, he was losing money. Money he had hoped to make by cutting corners with the new director. I turned off the television and went to my desk. I opened my ledger to the section marked Mayor Thompson, Secondary Interests. I began to write. I noted the date, the time of the stop work order, and the projected financial loss for Rick's company. The web was tightening. Rick was losing money, Kyle was losing his reputation, and Thompson was losing his legacy. And they were all starting to turn on each other. My phone buzzed again. It was an email from the mayor's secretary requesting a formal meeting to discuss a transition consultancy. I didn't reply. Not yet. I wanted them to stew in the silence for a little longer. I wanted the pressure to build until the cracks in their alliance became chasms. I went to my workshop and picked up a small, heavy mallet. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight. I wasn't going to use it on a person or even a building, but I was going to use it to ensure that when the final collapse happened, everyone would know exactly who had pulled the pin. The phone rang one last time before I went to bed. I checked the caller ID. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I had a feeling I knew who it was. I let it go to voicemail. The message was just 10 seconds of heavy breathing and the sound of someone, probably Kyle, sobbing quietly in a car. I slept better that night than I had in years. The first act of the play was over, and the audience was already starting to hiss. Tomorrow, I would start making the betrayers realize that their biggest mistake wasn't firing me. It was assuming I would go away quietly. I had built this town, and if I had to, I would be the one to show them exactly how it could come apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the truth. The sarcastic voice in my head whispered a final thought before I drifted off. I hope they like the view from the bottom, because the fall is only just beginning. The local diner, the Greasy Spanner, was the unofficial headquarters of the town's blue-collar workforce, and on Wednesday morning it was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and the low, rumbling hum of impending disaster. I sat in my usual booth at the back, a position that allowed me to see the front door and the reflection of the room in the large, grease-streaked window. I wasn't there for the food, I was there for the acoustics. In a town this size, news traveled faster than a water main leak, and I was currently the most popular topic of conversation. I saw Rick enter first. He looked like a man who had spent the night wrestling with a ghost and lost. His expensive leather jacket was stained with road salt, and his eyes were darting around the room, searching for someone to blame. He didn't see me at first. He marched straight to a table where two other contractors were sitting, their faces grim. "He's not answering," Rick barked, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "I've sent 4 emails and left 6 messages. The man is just sitting up on that hill watching us burn." "Can you blame him?" one of the other men asked, his voice laced with a reluctant respect. "You were the one standing next to Thompson when he gave Forrest the boot. Now you want him to bail you out because the kid doesn't know a silt fence from a picket fence?" Rick slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. "I've got a crew sitting idle. Thompson is threatening to pull my bond if I don't get that site cleared by Friday, but the environmental agents are crawling all over the place, and Kyle is in his office with the door locked." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. It was cold, but the bitterness was fitting. I waited until Rick finally turned and caught my reflection in the window. Our eyes met through the glass, and I gave him a small, polite nod, the kind of nod a doctor gives a patient with an incurable, though not fatal, condition. Rick stormed over to my booth, his face turning a vibrant shade of magenta. "Forrest, we need to talk, right now." "I'm having my tea, Rick," I said calmly. "And as you can see, I am currently occupied with being retired. It's a very demanding schedule, lots of staring at clouds and contemplating the passage of time." "Stop the act," he hissed, leaning over the table. "I know you tipped off the agency about the runoff. No one else knows those regulations like you do. You're trying to ruin me." "Ruin is a very dramatic word," I replied, leaning back. "I prefer to think of it as a mandatory education in compliance. You wanted a director who wouldn't bureaucratize your projects. Well, you got one. Kyle didn't bother to check the runoff because he was too busy picking out the color of his new business cards. I simply ensured that the law was upheld. Isn't that what a good citizen does?" Rick's hands were shaking. "I'm losing $10,000 a day, Forrest. If this continues, my firm is going to go under. I have a mortgage. I have the new boat." "Ah, the boat," I said, a sarcastic edge sharpening my voice. "The one you bought with the savings you made by using substandard aggregate on the Miller Street paving job? The one I told you to fix, but you went over my head to Thompson to approve? It seems the weight of that boat is starting to pull you down, Rick. Physics is a harsh mistress." He opened his mouth to retort, but he was interrupted by the sound of the diner's television. The local news was back on, and there was a live shot from the town square. There was Kyle, looking absolutely overwhelmed. He was being flanked by Lila, my niece, who was dutifully carrying a stack of files that looked far too heavy for her. "The mayor's office has announced an emergency audit," the reporter said. "Following the stop work order at the North End, questions are being raised about the structural integrity of the new downtown plaza. Interim Director Kyle Vance has declined to comment, but sources say the project is facing significant delays." The camera zoomed in on Kyle. He looked like he was about to burst into tears. Lila, ever the professional, stepped forward and whispered something in his ear. Kyle nodded frantically and started backing away from the microphones, nearly tripping over a traffic cone in the process. I looked back at Rick. "It looks like your problems are just beginning. If they audit the plaza, they're going to find those invoices for the high-grade steel you billed for, but never actually installed. I wonder where that steel went. Maybe it's in the hull of your new boat?" Rick turned pale. He knew I had the records. He knew that for every shortcut he'd taken, I had a corresponding entry in my private ledger. He turned and walked out of the diner without another word, his bravado completely extinguished. I felt a presence beside the booth. It was Lila. She slid into the seat Rick had just vacated, her eyes bright with a mix of fear and triumph. "He's falling apart, Uncle Forest," she whispered. "Kyle is literally hiding in the break room. Thompson is screaming at everyone, accusing the staff of leaking documents to you. He's convinced there's a mole in the office." "Is there?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Lila smiled, a sharp, intelligent smile that reminded me of my own. "I'm just doing my job. I'm giving him the files he asks for. It's not my fault if I give him the files that are the most complicated to understand. He doesn't even know what he's looking at." "Be careful, Lila," I warned. "Thompson is a cornered animal. He'll lash out at anyone nearby." "He's too busy lashing out at his own family," she said. "He and Kyle had a shouting match this morning that the whole floor heard. Thompson called him a useless anchor, and Kyle reminded his uncle whose idea the Legacy project was in the first place. The alliance is cracking." "Good," I said. "But we need to accelerate the process. Rick is the weak link. He's panicked about his finances. He's going to try to save himself by throwing Kyle under the bus. I want you to make sure Kyle knows that." "How?" "Leave a copy of Rick's private billing memos on Kyle's desk, the ones that show the discrepancy in the material costs. Let Kyle realize that his trusted partner has been skimming off the top of the mayor's favorite project. When they start fighting, they'll stop looking at me." Lila nodded, her mind already working on the logistics. "I can do that. But what about the media? They're starting to ask why everything was fine when you were in charge and why it's a disaster now." "Let them ask. The silence is my best weapon right now." After Lila left, I decided it was time for a more direct form of psychological pressure. I drove to the municipal garage where the city vehicles were kept. I still had my master key, an oversight Thompson had made in his haste to humiliate me. I didn't go inside to steal anything. I went to the parking lot where Rick's luxury SUV was parked next to his company truck. I didn't use a knife or a hammer. I used a small, specialized tool to slightly loosen the valve stems on his tires. It wouldn't cause an accident, and it wouldn't cause any permanent damage, but it would ensure that within an hour he would be stranded with 4 flat tires. It was a minor inconvenience, but for a man already on the edge of a nervous breakdown, it would feel like the world was conspiring against him. As I was leaving, I saw Kyle's car pull in. He looked exhausted, his tie hanging loose around his neck. He saw me and froze. We stood there in the quiet of the garage, the only sound the distant hum of the highway. "Forest," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, just tell me where the override codes are for the south side pumps. The pressure is redlining, and the digital override is locked out." "I told you, Kyle," I said, my voice smooth and detached. "I don't work for the city anymore. You're the director, you have the fresh perspective. Use it." "I can't," he yelled, his frustration finally boiling over. "The system is ancient. It doesn't make sense. Why would anyone build a pressure system that requires a manual bypass every week?" "Because the ground moves, Kyle," I said, stepping closer. "Because nature doesn't follow a digital blueprint. It's called maintenance. It's called knowing your terrain. You wanted the title, the salary, and the office. This is the work that comes with it. If you can't handle a pump station, how are you going to handle the plaza collapse?" "What collapse?" he whispered, his face going ashen. "The one that's coming," I said, leaning in. "When the audit reveals that the foundation is sitting on uncompacted silt because your foreman wanted to save a few $1,000s. You're the one who signed off on those inspections, Kyle. Your name is on the bottom of every one of those documents." I walked past him, leaving him standing in the middle of the asphalt. I didn't need to say anything else. The seed of doubt had been planted, and in a mind as fragile as Kyle's, it would grow into a forest of paranoia by nightfall. I drove home and spent the evening in my workshop. I wasn't working on plans or ledgers. I was working on a small mechanical project, a series of timed releases that would trigger the decorative fountains in the town square to run at maximum pressure at exactly 2 a.m. It was another minor thing, a nuisance that would flood the newly laid walkways and ruin the finish on the stone. Around 9 p.m., my phone rang. It was Clara. "Dad, I just heard," she said, her voice sounding breathless. "Rick and Kyle got into a physical altercation at the construction site. The police had to be called. No one was hurt, but they were screaming at each other about invoices and betrayal. It's all over the local social media groups." "Is that so?" I asked, feigning surprise. "It seems the stress is getting to them." "It's more than stress, Dad. People are starting to say that Thompson is going to resign. They're saying the whole administration is a house of cards." "A house of cards only falls when the wind blows, Clara," I said, "and I think a storm is coming." I hung up and looked at my ledger. I checked off the names: Rick, Kyle, Thompson. The betrayers were turning on each other, just as I had planned. They were so busy clawing at each other's throats that they hadn't realized I hadn't actually done anything illegal. I had simply stepped back and allowed their own greed and incompetence to become their undoing. As I prepared for bed, I looked out the window at the town lights. They were flickering slightly, a sign that the electrical grid was struggling with the erratic demands of the malfunctioning pump stations. It was a beautiful sight, the visual representation of a system in distress. I knew the mayor would call me tomorrow. He would be desperate. He would offer me my job back, probably with a raise and a public apology. And that was when the real revenge would begin, because I didn't want my job back. I wanted to watch him try to fix the mess he'd made, only to realize that the only person who could save him was the man he had tried to destroy. The cliffhanger wasn't whether I would win, it was how much of the town's established order would be left standing when I was finished. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind whistling through the eaves, a sarcastic smile firmly in place. The architect of ruin was just getting started. The rain began as a rhythmic tapping against my office window, a persistent sound that signaled a shift in the atmospheric pressure. In the engineering world, rain is never just weather. It is a stress test. It finds the gaps in the masonry, the oversights in the drainage, and the arrogance of those who think they can outsmart gravity with a flashy presentation. I sat in my armchair, watching the droplets race down the glass, while my phone sat on the desk like a dormant explosive. By 1 p.m., the dormant explosive was detonating every 10 minutes. The town's infrastructure was beginning to respond to the neglect. Without the manual overrides I'd performed for 3 decades, the overflow systems were backing up. I didn't need to be there to see it. I had the telemetry maps in my head. I knew exactly which manhole covers were starting to rattle and which basements in the downtown district were beginning to feel the damp creep of rising water. The first call I chose to answer was from a blocked number. It was Mayor Thompson. His voice lacked its usual booming authority. He sounded like a man standing on a dissolving sandbar. "Forest," he said, his breathing heavy. "I'm calling because we have a situation at the Southside pump station. The sensors are flashing red, and the digital bypass isn't responding. Kyle says there's a mechanical lockout he can't find. We need you to come down and walk him through it." "Walk him through it?" I asked, my voice as smooth as polished stone. "Arthur, you told the public that Kyle was the future. Surely the future doesn't need to consult a relic like me. Besides, I'm currently occupied with a very intricate woodworking project. It requires my full attention." "Forrest, listen to me." Thompson's voice rose an octave. "The businesses on Main Street are reporting backup. If that pump station fails, the damage will be in the hundreds of thousands. I'm prepared to offer you a consultancy fee, whatever you want." "It's not about the money, Arthur. It never was. It was about the integrity of the work. You chose to trade that integrity for a family favor. Now the work is responding in kind. Tell Kyle to check the secondary pressure release, if he can find it." I hung up. I knew Kyle wouldn't find it. The secondary release was hidden behind a false panel I'd installed in '04 after a local prankster tried to tamper with the main line. It wasn't in the blueprints because I'd paid for the panel out of my own pocket to ensure the town's security. An hour later, I was in my truck, driving toward the industrial district. I wasn't going to help, I was going to observe. I parked on a ridge overlooking the North End site where the stop work order was still in effect. Through my binoculars, I saw a scene of absolute chaos. Rick was there, standing next to his truck, which was currently being hoisted onto a tow-away flatbed. He looked like he was vibrating with fury. His luxury SUV was also being towed. Apparently, the 4 flat tires had caused him to block a fire lane, and the local traffic enforcement, likely pushed by a very frustrated town council, wasn't showing him any leniency. It was a minor victory, a pebble in his shoe that made every step painful. I saw Kyle pull up in a city-issued vehicle. He hopped out and began waving a stack of papers at Rick. Even from this distance, their body language was unmistakable. Kyle was accusing Rick of something, and Rick was responding with a finger-pointing tirade. I turned on my scanner, tuning into the city's private radio frequency. "It's your signature, Rick." Kyle's voice came through, distorted by static and panic. "You signed off on the compaction test for the plaza. If those results were forged, I'm not taking the fall for you. My uncle will have your license." "Your uncle is the one who told me to speed it up," Rick roared back. "He needed the plaza ready for the election. If I go down, I'm taking the whole administration with me. I have the emails, Kyle. I have every single one of them." This was the secret I had been waiting for. I knew Thompson was vain, but I hadn't been sure he was foolish enough to put his corruption in writing. Rick's desperation had confirmed it. The alliance wasn't just cracking, it was ready to shatter. I drove back toward the center of town, stopping at a small cafe near the town hall. I saw Lila sitting at an outdoor table, shielded by an umbrella. She looked up as I approached, a subtle nod being the only sign she recognized me. I sat at the table next to her, facing away. "The emails are in a folder marked Project Horizon on the mayor's private server," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I can't access them without a high-level override, but Thompson is panicking. He's been deleting files all morning." "He can't delete what's already been backed up by the automated server maintenance," I said softly. "The system I built has a rolling 30-day archive that even the mayor can't touch. It was designed to protect the town from accidental data loss, or intentional interference." "How do I get to it?" Lila asked. "You don't. I do, but I need to be inside the building, and I need the mayor and Kyle to be occupied elsewhere." "The town hall meeting is tonight at 7, Lila said. "Thompson is planning to give a speech about unforeseen geological challenges to explain the delays. He'll have Kyle there as a shield. The office will be empty." "Perfect," I said. "Make sure the side entrance is unlocked. I'll do the rest." As I walked back to my truck, I felt a strange sense of detachment. This was the peak of the revenge. It wasn't about the physical sabotage anymore. It was about the truth. The town deserved to know that their safety had been auctioned off for a few votes and a family legacy. I spent the afternoon preparing. I accessed my old remote access portal, one the IT department had forgotten to deactivate because they were too busy trying to figure out why the office printers were suddenly only printing the word incompetent in bold letters. I didn't do anything destructive. I simply set up a series of commands that would trigger during the town hall meeting. At 7 p.m., the rain turned into a torrential downpour. I stood in the shadows of the town hall's rear parking lot, watching the cars arrive. Thompson pulled up in his black sedan, looking grim. Kyle followed in a separate car, his shoulders hunched as if he expected someone to hit him. Rick arrived last, looking like a man who was ready to start a fight. Once they were inside, I moved. The side door was unlocked, just as Lila had promised. The building was quiet, the air smelling of floor wax and old paper. I made my way to the server room, my footsteps echoing on the linoleum. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I slipped into the engineering suite. My old office was a mess. Kyle had replaced my drafting table with a trendy standing desk that was covered in coffee stains and crumpled fast food wrappers. My framed awards were gone, replaced by a visionary leadership plaque that looked like it had been bought at a mall kiosk. I sat at the main terminal and entered my credentials. The screen flickered, and then the familiar interface of the city's backbone appeared. I navigated to the Project Horizon folder. As I opened the files, my sarcastic inner monologue finally went quiet. It was worse than I had imagined. There were spreadsheets detailing the cost savings achieved by using recycled materials in the bridge supports, materials I had specifically rejected 3 years ago. There were emails from Thompson to Rick telling him to streamline the inspection process and ensure the paperwork doesn't slow down the grand opening. And then I found the most damning piece of evidence, an email from Kyle to his uncle dated 2 weeks ago. "Uncle Arthur, Forest is right about the pressure in the south side. If we don't fix it, it's going to back up into the residential district. But if we fix it now, it will look like he was right. Can we wait until after the ribbon cutting?" Thompson's reply was a single sentence. "Make it wait. Appearances are everything." I felt a cold, hard clarity. They weren't just incompetent. They were willing to risk the homes of the people they served to protect their own pride. I didn't hesitate. I copied the entire folder to an external drive. Then I set up a final command. I left the building as quietly as I had entered. I drove to the town hall meeting, which was being held in the main auditorium. I stood at the back of the room, invisible in the crowd. On the stage, Thompson was in the middle of his speech. He was using a laser pointer to show a slide of the Legacy Plaza. "We are facing some challenges," Thompson said, his voice regaining some of its false bravado. Nature can be unpredictable, but with the fresh perspective of our new engineering team, we are navigating these waters. We ask for your patience. The future of this town is worth the wait." He looked toward Kyle, who nodded weakly. Rick was sitting in the front row, his arms crossed, his eyes boring into the back of Kyle's head. "However," Thompson continued, "there have been rumors of sabotage. Certain disgruntled former employees who would rather see this town fail than see it move forward without them." That was my cue. I reached into my pocket and pressed a button on my phone. The large projection screen behind Thompson flickered. The slide of the plaza vanished, replaced by a giant, high-resolution image of the email Kyle had sent his uncle. The words, "Make it wait. Appearances are everything," were highlighted in a glowing neon yellow. The auditorium went silent. It was a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Thompson turned around, his face going from pale to a sickly mottled gray. He stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open. "What is this?" someone shouted from the back of the room. "Is this real?" I didn't stay to hear the answer. I walked out of the auditorium and into the rainy night. As I reached my truck, I heard the first shouts of anger from inside the building. The sound was like a dam breaking. I drove toward the ridge overlooking the town. I pulled over and looked down at the lights. The rain was still falling, and I could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles heading toward the south side. The backup was happening, but now everyone knew exactly why. My phone vibrated. It was a text from Rick. I saw the screen. "I'm going to the station now. I'm telling them everything. You won, Forest. You happy?" I didn't reply. Happiness wasn't the goal. The goal was equilibrium. As I sat there, I saw a car speeding toward me on the narrow ridge road. It was Kyle's car. He must have seen me leave and followed me. He pulled up alongside my truck, his tires skidding in the mud. He jumped out, his face twisted in a mask of desperation and rage. "You ruined everything," he screamed over the sound of the rain. "You think you're so smart? You just ruined my life. You ruined my uncle's career." I rolled down my window, looking at him with a calm, detached pity. "I didn't ruin anything, Kyle. I just stopped hiding the ruins you were already building. You chose to ignore the pressure. Now you have to live with the explosion." He lunged toward my truck, but his foot slipped in the wet mud. He went down on his knees, his hands slapping into a deep puddle. He stayed there, sobbing, the rain soaking through his expensive suit. I looked at him for a moment longer, then put the truck in gear. "Go home, Kyle," I said. "The town council is going to have a lot of questions for you tomorrow. You might want to start practicing your answers." I drove away, leaving him behind in the dark. As I descended into the valley, I felt the sarcasm return to my internal monologue. "Well, Forrest," I thought, "they wanted a blockbuster. I'd say that was a pretty good climax. Now, all that's left is the fallout. The cliffhanger wasn't whether I would be vindicated. It was how Thompson and Rick would try to claw each other's eyes out as the legal system closed in on them. I was no longer the architect of ruin. I was just the man who had turned on the lights. The atmosphere inside the town hall, 3 days after the projection incident, was no longer one of civic order. It felt like the interior of a pressure cooker seconds before the seal fails. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the town saturated and sour-smelling, but the metaphorical storm was just beginning its second act. I stood in the lobby, leaning against a marble pillar, watching the chaos unfold with the detached interest of a geologist observing a landslide. I had been summoned not by the mayor, but by the town council's emergency oversight committee. Thompson was officially on medical leave, a euphemism for hiding in his basement with a lawyer, and Kyle had reportedly not been seen since he slipped in the mud on that ridge. Lila passed me in the hallway, carrying a box of files. She didn't stop, but as she brushed past, she murmured, "They're turning on the cameras in 5 minutes. Rick is in the green room, and he looks like he's ready to tear the wallpaper off the walls." I nodded almost imperceptibly. The final public humiliation was a choreographed event, and I was the lead choreographer, though I remained off stage for the moment. The council chamber was packed. Every seat was taken by residents whose basements had been flooded or whose commutes had been disrupted by the stop work orders. There was a low, angry murmur that surged into a roar when Rick was led to the witness table. He looked haggard. The vanity that usually defined him, the polished shoes, the expensive watch, had been replaced by a frantic, unkempt appearance. He sat down, and the cameras of the local news stations pivoted toward him like cannons. "Mr. Miller," the council chairwoman began, her voice brittle, "we are here to discuss the discrepancies in the billing for the Project Horizon Plaza, specifically the invoices for high-grade structural reinforcements that appear to be missing from the actual site." Rick looked toward the empty chair where Thompson usually sat, then at the camera. He knew he was being offered up as the scapegoat. He cleared his throat, the sound rasping through the microphone. I was following directives, he said, his voice cracking. Directives from the engineering office and the mayor himself. They told me the budget was tight. They told me to optimize the materials. Optimize? A councilman interjected. You used recycled scrap in a foundation meant for a public square. You billed us for premium steel. Where did that money go, Rick? Rick's eyes darted toward the back of the room, where I stood. I didn't look away. I didn't offer him a shred of sympathy. I simply waited. It went into the campaign, Rick blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. And yes, I took a management fee, but Kyle Vance signed every single order. He knew what was in the ground. He laughed about it. He called Forest Calder an antique who worried too much about things no one would ever see. The room erupted. The betrayal was no longer a secret whispered in cafes. It was a matter of public record. Rick began throwing out names, dates, and amounts, desperate to dilute his own guilt by drowning everyone else in it. He described how Thompson had promised him exclusive contracts for the next 10 years if he could just get the plaza finished before the next election cycle. He admitted to the fake compaction tests and the forged safety certificates. It was a symphony of self-preservation, and every note was a strike against the administration that had thought they could discard me. I walked slowly down the center aisle as the noise reached a crescendo. The crowd parted for me. I wasn't an official anymore, but in that moment I held more authority than anyone on the dais. I reached the witness table and laid a single physical folder in front of the chairwoman. This is the final audit of the Southside pump station, I said, my voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. I performed it this morning as a private citizen. The mechanical lockout Kyle Vance couldn't find wasn't a glitch. It was a safety feature triggered by his attempts to force a digital override on a system he didn't understand. If he had succeeded in forcing that valve, the entire West Side sewage line would have ruptured. He didn't just ignore the pressure. He nearly weaponized it through sheer ignorance. The chairwoman looked at the folder, then at me. Forrest, what would it take to fix this? To actually fix it? I leaned in, my sarcastic inner monologue providing a sharp commentary on the irony of the moment. It would take someone who cares more about the pipes than the press release. It would take a total reconstruction of the trust you broke when you let a man like Thompson turn this office into a family business. I turned toward the cameras. I knew Thompson was watching from wherever he was hiding. Arthur, I said, speaking directly into the lens. You wanted a fresh perspective. I hope you're enjoying the view from the wreckage. You tried to replace 30 years of experience with a suit and a smirk. This isn't sabotage. This is the natural consequence of arrogance meeting reality. The structures I built are still standing. The ones you built are currently being hauled away as evidence. The public humiliation was complete, but there was one final twist I hadn't expected. Clara stepped out from the side of the room, her eyes wet with tears, but her jaw set in a line of determination. She walked up to the council table and placed a small digital recorder next to my folder. My father didn't want me to involve myself, she said to the council. But I think you should hear this. It's a recording from a dinner I had with Kyle Vance a month ago. He thought he was impressing me. He thought I'd be happy to see my father replaced so he could finally move into the 21st century. She pressed play. Kyle's voice, arrogant and smooth, filled the room. Your dad is a great guy, Clara, but he's a dinosaur. He spends hours checking bolts that haven't moved in 20 years. Uncle Arthur and I are going to lean this department out. We're going to make a lot of people very wealthy, and we're going to do it by cutting the extra weight, starting with Forrest. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of total, irredeemable loss. The people in that room hadn't just been cheated out of tax dollars, they had been mocked. Their safety had been referred to as extra weight. I looked at Clara. I hadn't known she had the recording. She had been playing her own game of quiet observation, protecting me in her own way while I was busy planning my elaborate professional revenge. It was a humbling realization. I wasn't the only one who knew how to build a defense. As the meeting dissolved into a chaotic scramble of reporters and angry citizens, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Rick. He looked like he'd aged a lifetime in an hour. You have everything, don't you? He whispered. The invoices, the emails, the recordings. You're going to turn it all over to the state prosecutor. I already did, Rick, I said, about an hour before I came here. The state investigators are already at your office. I'd imagine they're having a very interesting conversation with your bookkeeper right now. Rick slumped back into his chair, his head in his hands. He was a man without a boat, without a business, and soon without a home. He had traded his integrity for a mountain of scrap metal and a few months of feeling powerful, and now the bill had come due. I walked out of the town hall, the cool air of the evening hitting my face. The lights of the town were steady now. I had gone back to the Southside pump station earlier that morning and quietly reset the manual bypass. Not for Thompson, and not for the council, but for the people who lived on the west side. I wasn't going to let them suffer just to prove a point. The point had already been proven. Lila caught up with me at my truck. She was grinning, a sharp, fierce expression. Thompson resigned 10 minutes ago, a written statement sent via his lawyer. Kyle is officially terminated, and there's a warrant being prepared for Rick's financial records. And you, Lila? I asked. What happens to the clerk who knew too much? I think I'm going to be very busy for the next few months, she said. The interim administration is going to need someone who knows where the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking, of course. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. The familiar rumble was a comfort. I looked at the building I had spent half my life in. It was a hollowed-out shell now, the corruption purged, but the future uncertain. I had achieved exactly what I set out to do. I had dismantled the betrayers using their own tools. I had watched them fall, not through violence, but through the weight of their own choices. But as I drove toward the ridge, I saw a line of headlights coming from the construction site at the plaza. The heavy machinery was being moved out. The Legacy project was a graveyard of unfinished concrete and rusted rebar. It was a scar on the heart of the town, and it would stay that way for a long time. My internal monologue was no longer sarcastic. It was reflective. I had won the war, but the landscape was changed forever. I had been the architect of this ruin, even if the materials were provided by my enemies. As I reached the top of the hill, I saw a figure standing by the road. It was Kyle. He looked like a ghost in the moonlight, his clothes tattered and his face a mask of hollowed-out despair. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't scream. He just watched me drive past, his eyes reflecting the taillights of the truck. He was the final piece of the collapse. He had wanted to be a builder, but he lacked the foundation. Now, he was just part of the debris. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. The house was quiet. The ledgers were closed. The revenge was executed flawlessly. But the town was still broken, and the water was still rising in the trenches of the plaza. The phone in my pocket buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The council wants to meet tomorrow at 8. They want to talk about a restoration contract. They say you're the only one who knows how to fix the foundation. I looked at the message for a long time. The architect of ruin had finished his work, but the town still needed an engineer. The final morning of the old administration felt like the air inside a cathedral, cold, still, and heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. I didn't wait for the council's 8 o'clock meeting. I had one final sequence to initiate, a physical manifestation of the structural truth I had been preaching for 30 years. I drove to the Project Horizon Plaza at 5 in the morning, the headlights of my truck cutting through a thick, low-hanging mist that clung to the unfinished concrete like a shroud. The site was a graveyard of ambition. Rusting rebar poked out of the ground like skeletal fingers, and the massive cranes stood frozen against the gray sky, their long arms casting shadows over the hollowed-out center of our town. I climbed out of the truck, carrying nothing but a heavy-duty flashlight and a small, handheld transmitter. The Legacy project was a fraud, built on a foundation of uncompacted silt and recycled scrap metal. I knew that the weight of the central fountain, a massive 20-ton marble monstrosity Thompson had ordered from Italy, was currently resting on a support beam that Rick had swapped for a cheaper, thinner grade of steel. In my pocket, I had the data showing that the moisture from the recent rains had turned the soil beneath that beam into a slurry. The entire structure was leaning just a few millimeters, but in engineering, a few millimeters is the difference between a monument and a catastrophe. I wasn't here to save it. I was here to ensure that when it failed, it did so in a way that left no room for excuses, no room for clerical errors, and no way for Thompson or Rick to escape the financial consequences of their greed. I saw a car pull into the gravel lot. It was Rick's company truck, though it looked battered, the side panel scratched from its recent trip to the impound lot. He stepped out, his movements jerky and desperate. He hadn't seen me yet. He walked toward the main support column of the fountain, shining a light on the base. He was looking for the cracks. He was looking for a way to patch the lie before the state inspectors arrived at noon. "It's not going to hold, Rick," I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. He jumped, spinning around and nearly dropping his light. When he saw it was me, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. You're always lurking in the shadows, Forest. You think you're so righteous? You're the one who let this happen. You could have stopped us." "I did try to stop you," I said, walking toward him. "I tried to stop you in the planning meetings. I tried to stop you during the budget hearings. But you wanted the boat, and Thompson wanted the votes. You didn't want an engineer, you wanted a magician. Well, the trick is over." "I can fix it," Rick hissed, grabbing a bag of high-tension grout from the back of his truck. "I can reinforce the base. If I can just get it stable through the inspection, I can sell my shares and walk away. I won't let you take everything from me. The soil is saturated, Rick. The water table rose 6 feet during the storm. That grout will just wash away into the silt. You're trying to build a fortress on a sponge." As we spoke, a second set of lights swept across the site. Mayor Thompson's black sedan screeched to a halt near the crane. He stepped out, his expensive wool coat ruined by the mud. He looked like a man who had lost his mind. He was clutching a briefcase to his chest as if it contained the cure for his ruined reputation. "Rick! Forest!" Thompson shouted, his voice echoing through the hollow plaza. "We have to settle this. Forest, I'll give you whatever you want. I'll sign the restoration contract. I'll give you a seat on the board. Just tell the inspectors the foundation is sound. Tell them it was just a minor drainage issue." I looked at the two of them, the man who had traded his honor for a title and the man who had traded his integrity for a paycheck. They were the architects of this ruin, and they were still trying to negotiate with the laws of physics. "It's too late for deals, Arthur," I said. "The physics don't care about your board seats. The weight of that marble is currently exerting 4,000 pounds of pressure per square inch on a beam that was rated for half that. Listen." We stood in silence. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then a sharp metallic crack rang out, like a gunshot echoing through the plaza. The ground beneath our feet shivered. "What was that?" Thompson whispered, his eyes widening. "That was the sound of the fresh perspective meeting reality," I said. I pulled the transmitter from my pocket. It wasn't a detonator, it was the remote control for the site's high-pressure water system, the one I had surreptitiously recalibrated the night before. I pressed the sequence. Across the plaza, the decorative fountains, the ones Kyle had insisted on installing before the drainage was finished, erupted into life. But they weren't spraying a gentle mist. They were geysers of high-pressure water, directed straight into the excavation pits surrounding the central fountain. "What are you doing?" Rick screamed, lunging toward me. I stepped aside, letting him stumble into the mud. "I'm performing a stress test, Rick. If your foundation is as solid as you claimed in your forged reports, a little water shouldn't hurt it. But if you lied, well, the water will find the truth." The water flooded the trenches, turning the silt into a liquid mess within seconds. The central column began to groan. It was a deep, guttural sound, the sound of steel screaming under a load it was never meant to carry. "Stop it! Forest, stop it!" Thompson was frantic, running toward the fountain as if he could hold it up with his bare hands. "Get back, Arthur," I yelled, my voice commanding and sharp. "The equilibrium is gone. It's coming down." I grabbed Thompson by the arm and hauled him back toward the perimeter. Rick was already scrambling toward his truck, his cowardice finally outweighing his greed. The collapse was cinematic. It didn't happen all at once. First, the secondary beam snapped, sending a shower of sparks into the air as it tore through an electrical conduit. Then, the marble fountain began to tilt, slowly at first, then with an accelerating, terrifying momentum. The ground buckled, the uncompacted soil erupting upward as the weight of the marble crushed everything beneath it. The sound was a deafening roar of concrete grinding against concrete, a cacophony of failure that shook the very foundations of the nearby buildings. A cloud of gray dust billowed into the air, obscuring everything for several seconds. When the dust cleared, the center of the plaza was a jagged crater of debris. The 20-ton fountain lay in pieces, a shattered heap of expensive stone and twisted metal. The legacy project was gone. In its place was a perfect physical representation of Thompson's administration, a hollow ruin built on a lie. Thompson fell to his knees in the mud, his briefcase spilling open to reveal nothing but empty folders and a few scattered campaign flyers. He looked at the wreckage of his career, his face a mask of total, crushing realization. He was finished. There would be no resignation with dignity, no medical leave that could explain this away. The disaster was too public, too absolute. Rick sat in his truck, the engine idling, his hands gripped so tightly on the steering wheel that they were white. He looked at me through the windshield, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. He knew that the state investigators wouldn't just be looking at invoices now, they would be looking at a crime scene. I walked over to the edge of the crater and looked down. The water from the fountains was still flowing, pooling in the bottom of the pit, and washing away the last of the fake grout. I felt a sense of profound, icy clarity. I hadn't raised a hand against them, I hadn't broken a single law. I had simply provided the environment where their own choices could reach their logical conclusion. I turned back to the truck and saw Clara and Lila standing by the entrance to the site. They had arrived just in time to see the end. Lila had her phone out, the recording of the collapse already being uploaded to every news outlet in the county. Clara looked at me, her expression one of complex relief. She knew the man I had become to do this, and she seemed to accept it. I walked toward them, the sarcasm finally drained from my mind, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. "Is it over?" Clara asked, her voice small against the settling dust. "The ruin is over," I said. The rebuilding starts tomorrow. I looked at the 2 men I had destroyed. Rick was already backing his truck out, likely heading for the state line, though I knew the police would be waiting for him at the first exit. Thompson was still in the mud, a broken man in a broken town. I climbed into my truck and adjusted the mirror. I looked at my own reflection. I looked older, perhaps, but there was a sharpness in my eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. I was the architect of ruin, but I was also the only man who knew how to clear the rubble. I drove past the gates, my tires crunching on the gravel. I didn't look back at the crater. I looked toward the town, where the lights were beginning to flicker on in the houses of the people who actually lived here. They would wake up to the news of the collapse, and they would be angry, and they would be afraid. But then they would call me. And for the first time in 30 years, when I answered the phone, I wouldn't be working for a mayor or a council or a legacy. I would be working for the foundation. I drove into the sunrise, the rhythmic hum of the engine a steady pulse in the quiet morning. The revenge was complete, flawlessly executed, and perfectly timed. The betrayers were gone, buried under the weight of their own arrogance. I was Forest Calder, the man who knew where the cracks were, and I was finally at peace. The story ended right there, at the peak of the triumph, with the dust still settling on the ruined plaza and the future of the town finally resting on a foundation of truth. I had shown them that you can fire an engineer, but you can't fire the laws of nature. And in the end, the laws of nature always have the last word. I tapped the steering wheel in time with a song only I could hear, a sarcastic, triumphant melody. The fresh perspective had been a failure. The old perspective, it seemed, was exactly what was needed to see the way forward. I shifted into 5th gear and accelerated, leaving the ruin behind me and the reconstruction ahead.